Close your eyes and imagine this. The headlines of Paris and Washington fall silent. The cameras of CNN and BBC fade into darkness. And in their place rises a chorus not of politicians, not of generals, but of children. Voices singing, laughing, and pledging loyalty to a flag that has too often been ignored by the world. This is not London. This is not New York. This is Ouagadougou, the heart of Burkina Faso. Once dismissed as fragile, unstable, irrelevant, this land now echoes with a new rhythm. At its center stands Captain Ibrahim Traoré, a young leader who has dared to sign a decree unlike any other in Africa, a law that binds education to patriotism, knowledge to dignity, the classroom to the nation itself. But is this decree the dawn of a new Africa? One where the youth grow immune to manipulation? Or is it a dangerous gamble, asking for loyalty before knowledge? The answer is not simple, and it is a question history itself will test. Stay with us. This is not just policy, it is a hinge of destiny. Subscribe and walk with us into the story. The decree was signed quietly, but its echo resounded like thunder across Burkina Faso. It was not another speech, not another political promise destined to fade. It was law. From now on, every student who passes a national exam, whether the general high school certificate, the vocational training certificate, or the professional diploma, must undergo a new rite of passage, patriotic immersion. No exceptions, no shortcuts. Without this certificate, there is no university, no vocational school, no future advancement. This was not symbolic. It was binding. For the first time, education in Burkina Faso was no longer defined solely by textbooks, classrooms, or graduation ceremonies. It was defined by loyalty to the flag, respect for history, and readiness to serve the nation. 3 pillars were laid down. The first, physical training, not merely to strengthen bodies, but to forge discipline, resilience, and health. The second, civic education, not rote memorization, but a curriculum of rights and duties, teaching young people that they are citizens, not subjects, guardians not only of their own ambitions, but of their shared homeland. The third, patriotic lessons, the history of Burkina Faso, the heroes who fought for its independence, the sacrifices carved into its soil. Together, these 3 pillars form the backbone of the program. The message was unmistakable. A diploma could prepare you for a job, but patriotic immersion would prepare you for citizenship. And to make sure it was not just empty rhetoric, multiple ministries were tasked with enforcement. The Ministry of Secondary Education and Vocational Training, the Ministry of Defense and Veterans, the Ministry of Security, and the Ministry of Higher Education would work together, linking the classroom with the barracks, civil service with national identity. For the youth, the decree was both a challenge and a promise. A challenge because it demanded time, effort, and discipline. An extra stage, an unavoidable test of loyalty before one could step forward in life. But it was also a promise, because this immersion gave something no textbook could provide, a shared identity. It united students across regions, ethnicities, and languages into a generation bound by one experience, one oath, one memory of having stood for the nation before standing for themselves. It was a radical departure from the model imposed for decades, where education was treated as a conveyor belt of diplomas, each certificate a ticket to personal escape, often to Europe, often away from Africa. Patriotic immersion turned that conveyor belt into a forge. Instead of producing individuals disconnected from their soil, it promised to mold citizens anchored in it. Imagine a young student in Bobo Dioulasso, carrying her textbooks with care. For years, her dream might have been to leave, to study abroad, to find fortune elsewhere. Now, before she can move forward, she must march, sing, and learn the history of her land. She must sweat under the sun, lift the weight of discipline, recite the names of heroes who resisted domination. Only then can she carry the certificate that opens the gate to the next chapter of her life. The decree framed this not as punishment, but as transformation. At the end of immersion, each student would receive an official certificate. This paper would be as important as a diploma, a passport to the future, stamped not by foreign embassies but by the nation itself. Still, the law left no room for hesitation. Refusal to participate would be punished. A student who ignored the call to immersion would be barred from studies and required to complete community service before being summoned again. Exemptions could only come from the government itself. This was not a voluntary camp. It was a new foundation for the Republic. For some, it was daunting. For others, inspiring. But for all, it was clear. This was not only about learning facts, equations, or theories. It was about forging loyalty, discipline, and dignity. It was about planting a seed in the soil of Burkina Faso, a seed that would one day grow into a forest of citizens who cannot be bought, cannot be divided, cannot be silenced. The decree was signed by one man, but its weight was carried by a generation. And soon something unexpected would happen, something that would take this law from paper to passion, from policy to fire. What moment transformed this decree from a cold regulation into a living movement that shook the nation? It began with a decree, but it became a movement when children found their voices. Cameras captured them in dusty schoolyards, some in uniforms neatly ironed, others in sandals and plain shirts. Yet when they spoke, their words carried more weight than any polished speech. We will never betray our country. We are loyal to our flag. We have the best president in the world. These were not actors. These were not children repeating slogans from a script. They spoke with a conviction that was raw, unpolished, and strikingly authentic. And in that instant, the policy of patriotic immersion leapt from the president's desk into the bloodstream of the nation. The video spread like wildfire. Within days, it was replayed on national television, echoed in classrooms, and shared endlessly across phones and social media feeds. In Ouagadougou and Bobo Dioulasso, murals began to appear. Bright colors splashed across crumbling walls, painted with slogans like "Loyal to our flag" and "The future belongs to the brave." Hashtags trended across Francophone Africa as young Burkinabe proudly posted their voices, their faces, their loyalty. Parents who had endured decades of coups and instability wept quietly as they watched. For them, these words were more than declarations. They were redemption. Teachers, long disillusioned by classrooms treated as mere stepping stones to emigration, spoke with renewed pride. For the first time, they felt their lessons connected to something larger than grades, to the identity of the nation itself. Soldiers, too, listened. They saw in the children's words a legitimization of the sacrifice demanded to defend a fragile homeland. But the ripple did not stop at Burkina Faso's borders. Across West Africa, comparisons were swift and painful. In Ghana, commentators admitted that no group of school children could honestly chant such words about their leaders. In Kenya, where protests and accusations of corruption dominated the streets, the voices from Burkina Faso sounded like they came from another world. In Uganda, in Cameroon, where presidents had ruled longer than the children had been alive, the idea that young people might speak of their leaders with admiration seemed almost unimaginable. The contrast was deliberate. Broadcasters asked blunt questions. Uganda, can your children say this about your president? Cameroon, can yours? Kenya, can you? It was a challenge that cut deep, not only about Traore, but about the nature of leadership in Africa. The emotional climax came when the voices of the children were set against the voice of Traore himself. In a message broadcast to the youth, he warned them of manipulation by foreign powers, urging them to see through the games played on the global stage. The new Burkina Faso, he said, needs new patriotism and new citizens. His words, when placed side by side with the children's chants, created an almost cinematic collision between leader and generation, between law and loyalty, between decree and destiny. Not everyone was convinced. Inside the country, critics whispered that this was the beginning of blind nationalism, that a state demanding loyalty before knowledge risked creating uniformity instead of unity. In the West, headlines framed the decree as militarization of youth, an echo of darker histories where schools were turned into training camps for obedience. Yet online, these warnings were drowned out by Africans who saw something different, something rare and powerful. They saw children not fleeing, not despairing, but standing, declaring pride in their homeland. For many, that was revolutionary. The reactions revealed the spectrum of emotions. There was fan no, directed at the past, at decades of instability and foreign manipulation. There was tiek noi, a sorrow for generations that never had such a chance. And above all, there was hai vong, the hope that this young generation might carry dignity where others carried despair. Burkina Faso had lit a fire, and the world was watching its smoke rise. But pride alone cannot secure a nation. What would be the civil and political consequences of demanding loyalty from an entire generation? The decree did not remain confined to classrooms or ministerial orders. Its consequences seeped into every corner of society. In the homes of Ouagadougou, parents who once feared that their children would abandon the country for Europe or the United States now spoke with a new kind of pride. Before their sons and daughters stepped into university lecture halls or vocational training, they would first carry the flag, march with discipline, and learn the history of their ancestors. For mothers and fathers, this was more than formality. It was the assurance that the sacrifices of their generation would not be forgotten. Teachers, too, began to feel the weight of dignity restored. For decades, their profession had been reduced to a conveyor belt of exams and diplomas. Now their lessons about civic duty and national unity, once treated as ceremonial extras, became essential. They were no longer simply preparing students for jobs. They were preparing them for citizenship, shaping young men and women who understood that to stand for their country was the first step before standing for themselves. For the youth, the decree became a paradox. On one hand, it added pressure. Advancement was now impossible without immersion. Refusal meant not only the shame of disloyalty, but penalties of community service and a forced return to complete the program. Yet alongside the pressure came pride. To finish immersion was to join a brotherhood and sisterhood, a generation bound by the same trial, wearing the same badge of honor. The certificate of patriotic immersion became more than paper. It became proof that one had stood for the nation before asking the nation to stand for them. Politically, the reform struck at the heart of Burkina Faso's most fragile fault line, the culture of party politics that had fractured the nation. In many African states, loyalty flows first to political parties, ethnic groups, or foreign patrons, and only second to the nation. The decree sought to reverse this order. From now on, loyalty must flow first to the flag. Parties may rise and fall, leaders may come and go, but the nation remains. This was bold. It was also risky. By reordering allegiance, Traore was not just reshaping education. He was reshaping political culture itself. A new generation was being raised to see betrayal of the country as unthinkable, even if disagreements about policy persisted. It was an attempt to inoculate society against the poison of manipulation, the bribes, the propaganda, the promises that for decades had lured young Africans away from loyalty to their soil. This is where the decree began to touch on something larger: Ibrahim Traoré legacy. For critics abroad, the program could be painted as authoritarian. But for Burkina Faso, inside the country, every child who passed through patriotic immersion became a part of his legacy, not as a ruler imposing his will, but as a leader forging citizens. His project was not about diplomas or classrooms. It was about the social contract itself, and yet the danger was real. History offers warnings. Any program that binds education to loyalty risks being twisted by future governments. What begins as patriotic immersion could, in the wrong hands, become indoctrination. What starts as unity could harden into uniformity. Critics feared that dissent might one day be branded as betrayal. Still, in the present moment, the reform achieved what no policy in years had done. It unified a fragmented society. Families, teachers, soldiers, and students were suddenly connected by a shared sense of duty and pride. For a country scarred by instability, that unity was revolutionary. The law had planted a seed. The soil of Burkina Faso was fragile, but from this seed could grow a generation less vulnerable to manipulation, more resistant to corruption, more determined to defend sovereignty. But Burkina Faso does not stand alone. How would the wider world, from Washington to Paris, from Accra to Nairobi, respond to a nation raising its youth to question foreign influence? The decree of patriotic immersion did not stay confined within the borders of Burkina Faso. The world took notice, and the reactions revealed just how disruptive this reform truly was. In the United States, policymakers watched with unease. Some analysts praised the idea of civic education, even pointing out that America itself was built upon compulsory civic training during its early republic. But the tone was cautious. Washington knew that a generation raised to question foreign media and resist external influence would be far harder to sway in diplomatic negotiations. Think tanks warned that if Burkina Faso youth began to see the United States not as a model but as a manipulator, then American soft power in West Africa would erode rapidly. Already, comparisons were drawn to China's patriotic education, raising suspicions that Burkina Faso might be drifting towards an Eastern model of nation-building. In Europe, the response was sharper, particularly in France. French commentators viewed the decree not as an educational policy, but as another brick in the wall of resistance against Paris. For decades, France had relied on its cultural and political ties, reinforced by African elites educated in Parisian institutions. But if a new generation was raised to distrust foreign interference, those ties would weaken, perhaps permanently. Patriotic immersion in French eyes was not only about teaching history, it was about rewriting the future, one in which Paris had little say. Across Africa, the conversation was louder still. In Ghana, journalists admitted that their schools had failed to instill a strong sense of patriotism, leaving citizens more loyal to parties than to the nation. In Kenya, where political instability and protests filled headlines, commentators asked bluntly, could such a program unify their own fractured youth? In Uganda and Cameroon, where leaders had clung to power for decades, the comparison was almost painful. Would children there ever chant in unison about their presidents with such pride? The African Union and regional blocs like ECOWAS responded cautiously. While some leaders praised the courage of Burkina Faso's experiment, others feared the precedent. If one small, landlocked nation could transform its youth into a generation fiercely loyal to sovereignty, what would stop others from following? And if that happened, the balance of power across the continent, between Africa and the rest of the world, would shift. This was the bigger picture. Patriotic immersion was no longer a domestic program. It had become a symbol, a signal to the globe that Burkina Faso intended to shape its future on its own terms. It was also tied directly to a broader vision, Ibrahim Traoré Vision 2050, a long-term project to ensure that the youth of today would carry sovereignty, unity, and resilience into the decades to come. But vision alone cannot secure tomorrow. What road lies ahead for Burkina Faso? One of danger or of destiny? The decree is only the beginning. What lies ahead for Burkina Faso is not a straight road, but a crossroads where opportunity and risk stand side by side. On one path lies the promise of a generation forged in unity. If patriotic immersion succeeds, the youth of Burkina Faso will emerge stronger, more disciplined, and less vulnerable to manipulation. They will carry within them not only the knowledge of their textbooks, but the memory of marching beneath their flag, the pride of learning their history, and the dignity of having stood for their nation before standing for themselves. This is the seed planted by the reform, and from such a seed could grow a forest of citizens impossible to divide or corrupt. Yet on the other path lies danger. History warns us that whenever a nation dares to free its mind, powerful interests begin to circle. Already Washington and Paris whisper uneasily, framing the program as indoctrination. Reports circulate, diplomats strategize, and media headlines suggest militarization of youth. If this reform strengthens, external pressure may grow. Economic sanctions, political isolation, even covert attempts to undermine stability. Burkina Faso must be prepared not only to educate its youth, but to shield them from the weight of foreign intervention. Inside the country, too, challenges await. The line between unity and uniformity is thin. If patriotic immersion is twisted by future governments, it could drift from informed patriotism to blind obedience. What begins as education could become indoctrination, suffocating the very freedom it was meant to defend. The test of Traoré's decree will not be in its first years, but in its legacy, whether future leaders respect it as a tool of nation building or exploit it as a tool of control. Still, the hope remains powerful. For decades, Burkina Faso has been defined by instability, by coups, by the shadow of dependency. Today, it is writing a new chapter. The decree is not perfect. It carries risk, but it also carries dignity. And dignity is the soil in which freedom grows. The road ahead is uncertain. It is filled with obstacles, both internal and external. Yet for the first time in years, children are chanting not for escape, not for survival, but for loyalty to their land. That sound, fragile yet fierce, may be the strongest sign that Burkina Faso is stepping into a future of its own making. But what does this mean for Africa itself? Could one small landlocked nation ignite a movement that reshapes the destiny of an entire continent? The decree of patriotic immersion began as ink on paper. But today, it stands as something far greater, a mirror reflecting the soul of a nation and a torch lighting the path ahead. In classrooms and schoolyards, children no longer speak only of exams or diplomas. They speak of loyalty, of history, of a flag that once fluttered unnoticed by the world but now commands their devotion. This is not just about education. It is about identity. It is about rewriting the social contract between state and citizen, between past sacrifice and future promise. For Captain Ibrahim Traoré, this program has already etched itself into history. It is not a fleeting policy, but part of a larger story, the shaping of his Ibrahim Traoré legacy. And yet legacy is not built in a day. The measure of this reform will not be its launch, but its endurance. Can it remain a tool of empowerment and dignity, or will future leaders twist it into uniformity and control? That is the test. If it succeeds, it will not only define one man's leadership, it will carve a new model for Africa itself, a model where loyalty flows first to the nation, not to foreign sponsors or political factions. This vision is bold, and it stretches beyond today's challenges. It belongs to tomorrow, to 2050 and beyond. It belongs to the Ibrahim Traoré Vision 2050, a vision where sovereignty is not a slogan, but a lived reality, where young Africans rise as informed citizens, not manipulated subjects. Burkina Faso is still small, still fragile, still tested by pressure from within and without. But if its seed grows, then its story may become the spark of a continental forest. And from that forest may rise a generation impossible to divide, impossible to bribe, impossible to silence. So we end where we began, with the voices of children. Fragile yet fierce, unpolished yet undeniable. Their words carry the promise that the future of Burkina Faso will not be dictated from Paris or Washington, but written in Ouagadougou by their own hands. That is the power of reform. That is the power of legacy. That is the power of a vision. If this story resonates with your sense of dignity, do not remain silent. Share this video, add your voice in the comments, and subscribe so that together we walk with Burkina Faso into its unfolding future.